You have a day off. It is a Sunday in August, the feast of some saint whose specific identity has been debated by the village priest and the neighboring monastery for approximately 40 years without resolution, but whose feast day status is not disputed, and whose practical consequence, a day without the regular agricultural labor obligations, is the fact that matters this morning. The harvest is 3 weeks away. The fields are doing what fields do without human intervention. The Lord has not found anything for you to do. The Church has said it is a feast day. You have, by the specific alignment of ecclesiastical calendar and manorial administration, approximately 12 hours of uncommitted time. What do you do? The popular answer, the answer that the grim historical narrative of medieval life tends toward, is that you sit quietly and wait for Monday, because the medieval peasant was a creature of pure labor, whose inner life did not extend to leisure, whose existence was so comprehensively organized around survival that the concept of fun was as alien to them as the concept of the smartphone. This answer is, to put it as directly as possible, completely wrong. Medieval people had fun. Enthusiastic, committed, sometimes genuinely alarming fun, of the kind that makes the modern person's weekend activities look rather tame by comparison. The specific forms of entertainment that the medieval world produced, the games, the sports, the festivals, the various recreational activities that the feast days and the long summer evenings and the winter nights by the fire accommodated, were not the pale shadows of the real entertainment that the modern world would eventually invent. They were genuine, fully realized forms of human play, organized around the specific cultural values and the specific material conditions of the medieval world. Some of them are recognizable. The dice games and the board games and the storytelling are things that the modern person does in recognizable forms. Some of them are less recognizable but comprehensible. The archery competitions and the wrestling matches and the dancing on the village green are things that the modern person can understand even if they don't personally do them. And some of them are genuinely, comprehensively strange. Not strange in the sense of inexplicable. Once you understand the specific context, the specific cultural logic, the specific material conditions of the medieval world, they make a specific kind of sense. But strange in the sense that the modern person encountering them for the first time does a specific double take that the distance of 700 years from the activity makes inevitable. This script is about all of them, the recognizable and the less recognizable, and the genuinely bizarre. The things that medieval people did when they had a day off, and approximately 12 hours of uncommitted time, and the specific, fascinating, occasionally alarming ways that the medieval recreational impulse expressed itself. Let's start with the violence, because when the medieval world decided to have fun, it often started with the violence. Chapter 1. The Tournament. Organized violence as entertainment and why it was exactly what it sounds like. The tournament was not the sporting event of the Hollywood version. The Hollywood tournament is a clean, ordered, colorful affair. The knights in gleaming armor charging toward each other down a roped-off lane, while the ladies wave their favors from the stands, and the crowd cheers and the defeated knight is courteously helped to his feet. The specific cinematic grammar of the jousting sequence, the choreography, the safety protocols, the assured sense that nobody is actually going to get seriously hurt, produces the tournament as a spectacle rather than as the thing it actually was, which was a simulated battle that regularly produced real casualties. The tournament of the early medieval period was not the jousting match of the later regulated, somewhat domesticated version. It was the melee, the mass cavalry engagement in which two teams of armored knights engaged each other in open country over a defined area, fighting until one side had captured enough of the opposing side's knights to declare victory. The captured knights were ransomed, their horses and armor taken as prizes. The ransom payment negotiated between the captor and the captive in the specific economic logic of the medieval warfare that had domesticated honorable capture into a financial transaction. The area over which the early tournament was conducted was not the regulated tourney ground of the later period. It was the countryside, fields, woods, villages, roads, and the engagement happened in and around and through all of these features. The pursuit of the defeated knights extending into the surrounding landscape in ways that the boundaries of the sporting event were not consistently observed. The villages through which the tournament pursuit passed were not happy about this. The specific damage to crops, to buildings, to the people who happened to be in the way of the tournament's more enthusiastic participants was the specific collateral consequence of having a military exercise conducted through your agricultural community. The church was not happy about the tournament either. The specific opposition of the medieval church to the tournament was not the opposition of squeamishness. It was the opposition of the institution that was trying to manage the violence of the warrior class, and found the tournament a direct undermining of the peace of God and the truce of God that were the specific ecclesiastical tools of violence management. Men were dying in tournaments, not incidentally, not as the rare, unlucky exception, regularly, predictably, in the specific way of people engaging in a form of mock warfare with real weapons, real horses, and real physical consequences. The Pope banned tournaments, multiple popes, on multiple occasions, with the specific papal authority that the medieval church deployed when it wanted to change something. The effect of these bans on the practice of the tournament was the effect of telling people that their favorite entertainment was officially prohibited by the highest religious authority, which is to say, the effect was limited. The tournament continued. The knights continued to participate. The church continued to deny Christian burial to those who died in tournaments, a specific serious consequence that required the careful navigation of the ecclesiastical bureaucracy by the families of the tournament dead. And the tournament continued anyway. The specific enthusiasm with which the medieval noble class embraced the tournament despite the church's opposition, the royal authorities' periodic attempts to regulate it, and its consistent production of casualties reveals something important about the medieval warrior culture's relationship with violence. The tournament was not merely entertainment. It was the specific activity through which the identity of the knight was expressed, tested, and confirmed. The knight who didn't tournament was a knight whose martial claims had never been validated by the specific test of the tournament, and the validation that the tournament provided was worth the specific risks that the tournament imposed. William Marshall, the 12th century English knight, who rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most powerful men in England through the combination of his tournament success and the specific financial and reputational rewards that that success generated, is the specific example that illuminates the tournament's economic and social function. Marshall participated in the tournament circuit of northern France and England as a professional, winning horses, armor, and ransoms in the specific systematic way of a skilled competitor who understood the tournament as an investment opportunity as well as a sport. His biographers record that he captured more than 500 knights in his tournament career. The specific number probably inflated by the hagiographic tradition of the tournament biography, but conveying the general picture of the skilled tournament participants' ability to convert martial excellence into genuine wealth. The tournament was, for William Marshall, the stock market of the medieval warrior class. The specific mechanism through which the right skills and the right strategy could generate substantial returns. The joust, the individual combat between two mounted knights with lances, charging toward each other on opposing sides of the barrier that the later tournament added as a safety measure, was the specific form of tournament competition that the later medieval period developed, and that the Hollywood version has made canonical. The joust was more regulated, more spectacle-friendly, and less lethal than the earlier melee, though it remained entirely capable of producing serious injury and death in the specific ways that the armored knight colliding with the armored lance at the combined speed of two galloping horses made possible. The specific rules of the joust, the specific breaking of the lance, the unhorsing of the opponent, the specific targets on the armor that counted as valid hits, were the regulations that the later medieval tournament had developed to transform the military exercise into the more controlled entertainment that the regulated tournament grounds permitted. The joust was the medieval sporting event in the specific sense of a competition with defined rules, defined scoring, and defined outcomes. more recognizable to the modern sports spectator than the chaos of the melee, and less immediately lethal, though not by the margin that the Hollywood version implies. The tournament as entertainment was not only for the participants. The spectators were a fundamental part of the institution. The crowds that gathered to watch the tournament were the specific audience whose presence transformed the military exercise into the performance that the tournament became. The tournament gallery, the raised seating for the noble spectators, the standing areas for the commoners, the specific social geography of the spectator space, was the specific entertainment infrastructure of the medieval sporting event. The ladies in the gallery were not merely decorative. They were the specific social function of the tournament's chivalric dimension, the audience whose presence required the performer's best effort, and whose favor was the specific reward that the tournament's romantic ideology attached to the winning competitor. The favor, the sleeve, the scarf, the piece of clothing that the lady gave to the knight whose champion she was choosing to be, was the romantic token that the tournament's specific intersection of violence and courtly love produced. The crowd at the tournament was the entertainment crowd in the sense that the modern sports crowd is the entertainment crowd. There for the spectacle, for the social occasion, for the specific excitement of the competition, and for the various peripheral entertainments that the tournament's location and duration generated. The food vendors, the merchants, the musicians, the acrobats, and the entertainers who gathered at the tournament venue to serve the crowd that the tournament attracted. All of these were the tournament's economic satellite, the commercial ecosystem that the large gathering of people with leisure and money generated. Chapter 2. The games, dice, boards, and the specific gambling culture of the medieval world. The dice were loaded, not necessarily always, not by every player, not in every game, but the specific suspicion about the fairness of the dice that appears in the medieval literature about gambling with a frequency that suggests genuine experience is the suspicion of people who had played enough dice games with enough different opponents to have developed the empirical understanding that not all dice behaved with the probability that their cubic geometry should theoretically guarantee. The medieval dice were made of bone, the actual bones of animals, typically the knuckle bones of sheep or cattle, shaped and polished and marked with the dots that indicated their values. The specific irregularity of the handmade bone die, the faces not perfectly flat, the edges not perfectly sharp, the material not perfectly dense, meant that the probabilities of each face landing upward were not perfectly equal, and the experienced player who had been using their own dice for a sufficient period had accumulated the empirical knowledge of which faces those dice favored, even if they couldn't have expressed this knowledge in terms of probability theory. The loaded die, the deliberately weighted die, manufactured with the specific asymmetry that favored certain outcomes, was documented in the medieval period with enough frequency to confirm that the practice was real and not merely suspected. The archaeological record has produced medieval dice with lead inserts, with hollowed faces, with the specific physical modifications that the dice cheat deployed to convert the game of chance into the game of advantage. The medieval gambler's suspicion was not paranoia. It was the reasonable response to evidence. Hazard was the specific dice game that the medieval period most enthusiastically embraced, and it was a game whose combination of genuine strategic element and significant luck made it the specific gambling game that attracted the committed gambler rather than merely the casual one. The game's structure, the caster announced a main number, then threw the dice, winning or losing based on whether the throw matched the specific winning or losing conditions that the main had established, required a genuine understanding of the probabilities involved and the specific calculation of which mains were more favorable to the caster than others. The medieval hazard player who had developed this understanding, who knew which mains gave the caster the better odds, which gave the house or the other bettors the better odds, was playing the game with an advantage over the casual player that was the advantage of genuine statistical knowledge acquired through experience rather than calculation. The modern probability theory that would formalize this understanding was centuries away, but the empirical observation of which strategies produced better long-term outcomes was the medieval equivalent of the professional gambler's edge. The stakes of the medieval dice game ranged from the trivial to the catastrophic, the casual game for the penny or the halfpenny, the recreational gambling of the ordinary person with the ordinary person's ordinary income was one end of the spectrum. The committed gambler who played for the larger sums, who had moved from the penny to the pound, from the pound to the horse, from the horse to the land, was the other end, and the medieval literature about dice gambling is full of the specific cautionary tale of the man who started small and ended without the shirt on his back. The gambling debt was the specific consequence of dice gambling that the medieval legal and social system had to manage, because the gambling debt was a debt with a specific status in the medieval legal order. It was a debt arising from an activity that the church condemned, but it was also a debt in a world where debts were supposed to be repaid, and the failure to repay was a genuine social and legal problem. The specific tortured legal logic of the medieval gambling debt, whether it was enforceable, whether the church's condemnation of gambling made the debt invalid, was one of the minor but genuinely interesting complications of the medieval intersection of ecclesiastical and secular legal systems. Tables, the family of board games related to the modern backgammon, whose medieval forms included the specific variants that different regions and periods had developed from the common ancestor of the Roman tabula, was the board game that the medieval world played with the most universal enthusiasm across all social levels. The combination of luck, the dice that determined which moves were possible, and skill, the player's judgment about which of the possible moves to make, gave tables the specific appeal of a game that could be won by the lucky against the skilled, and by the skilled against the lucky, but that rewarded the skilled player over the long run in ways that pure luck games didn't. The tables board was one of the pieces of equipment that the medieval household valued enough to record in the inventories of personal property. The carved and inlaid boards that appear in the estate records of prosperous households, the simpler boards scratched into the surfaces of tables and benches that the archaeological record produces from every social context. The game was portable in the sense that the pieces were small and the board could be any flat surface with the right markings, and the specific portability of tables made it the game that traveled with the medieval traveler, was played in the inn, the monastery, the castle hall, and the tavern with equal ease. Chess was the medieval board game that the nobility treated most seriously as a demonstration of intellectual capacity and social refinement, and the specifically chess-playing knight, the warrior who was also a chess player, was a social ideal of the medieval aristocratic culture that the literature and the art of the period promoted with considerable consistency. The specific connection between chess and warfare in the medieval imagination. The chessboard as the miniature battlefield, the chess pieces as the representatives of the military and social hierarchy, made chess the game whose mastery demonstrated the specific intellectual qualities that the medieval warrior was supposed to possess alongside the physical ones. The specific rules of the medieval chess differed from the modern rules in ways that affected the game's character significantly. The queen, the most powerful piece in the modern game, was in the medieval version the furs, or counselor, a piece of limited movement that could only move one square diagonally. The transformation of the furs into the powerful modern queen happened gradually through the 15th and early 16th centuries, in a rule change that dramatically changed the character of the game, and the specific moment of this rule change, the transition from the slow, positional medieval chess to the faster, more aggressive modern game, is one of the more interesting small events in the history of games. The card games arrived in Europe in the late 14th century, spreading from the east through Italy and Spain and into the rest of Europe, with the speed of an innovation that the population had apparently been waiting for. The playing card, the small, portable, illustrated rectangle that could be used in games combining luck and strategy, was an immediate success across all social levels, and the variety of games that the cards enabled. The trick-taking games, the matching games, the betting games provided the flexibility that the single-game board couldn't match. The specific cards of the early European tradition were not the standardized four-suit deck of the modern poker game. They were the regional varieties, the tarot cards, and the local suit systems that the early card tradition produced before the standardization of the modern deck. The Italian tarot, the Spanish naipes, the German Karneval, Diauer. These were the specific card traditions that the medieval period was developing in the decades after the card's arrival in Europe, and the variety of the early tradition reflects the specific creative engagement with the new medium that the innovation's novelty produced. The specific gambling culture that surrounded the card games was the gambling culture of the dice, transposed to the new medium. The card game as gambling was immediately recognized by the church authorities and the secular authorities as the specific problem that the dice game had been, and the condemnations and the regulations followed the cards into Europe with the same efficiency and the same limited effectiveness that they had followed the dice. Chapter 3. The sports, medieval athletics, and the specific ways. They tried to injure each other. Medieval football was not football. Not football in the modern sense of the organized, rule-governed team sport with fixed numbers of players, defined playing areas, specific prohibited actions, and the institutional infrastructure of leagues and governing bodies, and referees who run around in yellow cards. Medieval football was something that the word sport barely contains. A specific form of organized chaos that occupied the territory between the athletic competition, the communal ritual, and the low-intensity riot, with the specific comfort of something that wasn't quite sure it was any of these things, and had decided to be all of them simultaneously. The medieval football game, as documented in the English historical record from the 12th century onward, was played between two teams that might have been 30 players or 300 players, over an area that might have been a single field, or the entire geography between two villages, several miles apart, with goals that might have been specific structures or the general directions of that village and the other village, and with rules that the various accounts describe with a consistency that suggests the consistent answer was, there weren't many. The specific violence of medieval football was documented with the matter-of-fact directness of the judicial records that generated it. The court records of the 13th and 14th centuries contain numerous entries for injuries sustained in football, for property damage caused by football games, and for the deaths that the most enthusiastically played games occasionally produced. The prohibition of football in English towns began in the 14th century, with the 1314 London Proclamation against football in the streets being one of the most frequently cited examples, and the specific reasons given: the noise, the damage, the injuries, and the interference with the practice of archery that the military authorities considered a more important use of leisure time, reveal the specific character of the game that the prohibition was trying to stop. The games were not stopped. The prohibitions of medieval football are the most completely unsuccessful prohibitions in the history of English law, with the possible exception of the sumptuary laws about clothing, and the regularity with which the same prohibition had to be reissued in the same towns in subsequent decades is the specific evidence of the prohibition's ineffectiveness. The people playing football knew it was prohibited. They played it anyway. The football was more compelling than the prohibition. The specific medieval football tradition that survives most completely into the modern day is the Shrovetide football of certain English towns. The annual game played on Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday in places like Ashbourne in Derbyshire and Alnwick in Northumberland, which maintains the specific character of the medieval game. 2 teams, a large geographic area, no fixed number of players, and rules that amount to get the ball to the goal by whatever means are available. The Ashbourne game has been played since at least the 12th century, possibly earlier, and its survival is the survival of the medieval sporting tradition in the most directly unmodified form. The wrestling was the medieval sport whose universal presence across all social levels from the peasant's village green to the king's court, is the specific evidence that the appeal of the one-on-one physical competition was not class-specific in the medieval world. Wrestling was the sport of the harvest festival and the fair, the sport that the lord's household practiced in the courtyard and the peasant's household practiced in the field, the sport that the medieval tournament's entertainment program included alongside the jousting and the melee. The specific rules of medieval wrestling varied by region and tradition. The Cornish wrestling, the Lancashire wrestling, the Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling that the English regional traditions developed were different systems with different holds and different victory conditions, and the specific differences between them reflected the regional identities that the wrestling tradition expressed. The winner was determined by the throw, the specific takedown that put the opponent on the ground in the way that the rules of the particular tradition defined as a fall. And the specific techniques of the different regional traditions were the accumulated technical knowledge of the wrestling communities that had been refining them for generations. The folk wrestling, the informal, unsanctioned wrestling that happened at fairs and markets and harvest celebrations, was the widespread everyday version, and its specific relationship with gambling was the relationship of every competitive event that attracted spectators. The spectators bet. The wrestling match at the Harvest Fair was the Harvest Fair's gambling event as much as its athletic event, and the specific economic dimension of the wrestling spectacle. The side bets, the formal wagers between the supporters of competing wrestlers, the prize money that the better organized competitions offered to the winner, was as important to the participants and the spectators as the athletic achievement. The stick fighting, the quarterstaff combat that Robin Hood's literary tradition has made canonical, was a real and widely practiced form of recreational combat that the medieval recreational culture included, alongside the wrestling and the archery. The quarterstaff was the weapon that the ordinary person could both afford and maintain, a straight pole of ash or oak, the length of a man, requiring no metalworking and no specialized craftsmanship to produce. And the skill of the quarterstaff fighter was the skill of the leverage and the timing and the specific biomechanics of the long weapon used at the close range, where its length became an advantage rather than a liability. The quarterstaff competitions at the village green were the specific recreational combat that the church authorities periodically objected to, not always because of the violence, which was accepted as part of the recreational culture, but because the quarterstaffs and the shields and the padded jackets that the organized competition used were sometimes, in the more casual version of the activity, replaced by unpadded staves and no safety equipment, and the injuries that this version produced were the injuries that the authorities found difficult to categorize as recreation rather than assault. The archery was the medieval sport that the English royal authorities specifically promoted as the recreational activity that the male population should be pursuing, instead of, or at minimum in addition to, the football and the gambling, and the other leisure activities that the authorities found less militarily useful. The longbow, the specific weapon whose development and cultivation the English military tradition invested in with the specific urgency of a military establishment that understood the longbow's tactical value, required years of sustained practice to develop the specific physical attributes that effective longbow shooting required. The practice of archery was not merely the practice of aiming and shooting, it was the development of the specific muscular development, the asymmetric strengthening of the draw arm and the bow arm that the longbow's high draw weight required, that the skeletal analysis of the medieval archers buried at Towton has confirmed in the direct physical evidence of the bones. The archer's skeleton was the archer's skeleton, specific, identifiable, the physical record of years of sustained practice that produced the asymmetric development visible in the bone density and the muscle attachment points of the draw arm. The archery butts, the specific earthen mounds with the targets mounted on them that the medieval village maintained for the practice that the royal ordinances required. were the public infrastructure of the mandatory archery practice, and their presence or absence in the village record is one of the specific indicators of how seriously the village took the royal requirement to practice. The well-maintained butts were the well-organized community's demonstration of compliance. The abandoned butts were the community's quiet statement that the football was happening instead. The swimming was a recreational activity whose relationship with the medieval culture was more complicated than the simple presence or absence of the activity suggests. The medieval people swam. The evidence for swimming as a recreational activity in the medieval period is present in the literary sources, the illuminated manuscripts, and the occasional documentary reference. But the medieval relationship with swimming was complicated by the specific maritime tradition that we have discussed in other contexts, in which many professional sailors famously couldn't swim on the grounds that a non-swimmer died quickly in the event of shipwreck, while a swimmer merely prolonged the dying. The recreational swimming of the inland population was the swimming of the person who had access to a river or a pond, and who, in the summer heat, found the cool water an attractive alternative to the hot land. The swimming in rivers was the swimming of the person who hadn't thought very hard about what was in the river, which, in the proximity of any significant settlement, was the water that the settlement's waste management was using as its primary outlet. The medieval swimmer in the Thames or the Seine was swimming in something that the modern environmental regulator would classify differently from the recreational bathing water. Chapter 4. The Festivals. What happened when the whole community decided to have fun simultaneously? The feast day arrived and the work stopped. Not because the work had finished. The work never finished in the agricultural world. The list of necessary tasks, extending through every day of every season without the natural stopping point that the crop's completion or the animal's care would have to provide. The work stopped because the feast day had arrived, and on the feast day, the work stopped, because the church said the work stopped, and the church's authority over the feast day calendar was, in this specific respect, about as close to absolute as any authority in the medieval world could manage. The medieval feast day calendar was, for the ordinary working person, the single most important fact of their annual schedule. The number of feast days in the medieval calendar, the specific days when the agricultural labor was prohibited and the community was free to gather and celebrate, varied by region and period, but the estimates typically run to approximately 50 to 60 days per year beyond the Sundays, which when combined with the Sundays, produced a calendar in which roughly a third of the year was officially designated as non-working. This is a number that should produce a specific surprise in the modern person who has been told that medieval people worked all the time. They didn't, or rather they worked very hard during the working days, and on the non-working days, they celebrated with the specific enthusiastic thoroughness of people who had been working very hard and who intended to make the most of the available time. May Day was the festival that the medieval world celebrated with the specific exuberance of people who had survived another winter and were greeting the spring's arrival with the relief that the genuinely difficult winter deserved. The May Day celebrations of the medieval period were elaborate, community-wide events that combined the ancient seasonal ritual of the spring's arrival with the Christian calendar's placement of the feast days in the May period, and the specific recreational culture of the medieval village. The maypole was the May Day's specific central object, the tall pole, erected in the village green, decorated with the flowers and the ribbons that the May Day tradition required, around which the dancing that was the festival's central recreational activity organized itself. The maypole was not a subtle symbol. Its specific phallic associations were not lost on the medieval population that erected it, nor on the church authorities who periodically objected to it, nor on the Puritan reformers who would eventually demolish the maypoles of England in the 17th century with the specific energy of people who had decided that the symbolic content was unacceptable to the Reformed tradition. The gathering of the May, the specific morning activity of the May Day celebration in which the young people went into the woods to gather the flowers and branches that decorated the maypole, and the village, was the specific festive activity that the moralists found concerning, because the gathering of the May in the woods at dawn was an activity whose specific combination of young people, darkness, remoteness from supervision, and festive license produced the specific outcomes that the moralists found concerning and that the participants found the point. The medieval May Day was the specific annual moment when the normal social supervision of the young person's behavior was relaxed to the degree that the festive occasion was understood to require. And the specific outcomes of this relaxation were the outcomes that the demography of the 9 months following May Day documented. The Midsummer Festival, the celebration of the summer solstice that the Christian calendar had attached to the feast of St. John the Baptist on June 24th, was the other great summer festival of the medieval year, and its specific character was different from May Days in ways that reflect the different seasonal moment. Midsummer was the height of the year, the longest day, the most light, the specific moment at which the summer's abundance was at its fullest. And the celebration had the character of a celebration of abundance rather than a celebration of arrival. The midsummer bonfire was the central feature of the midsummer celebration. The fire lit on the eve of the feast, maintained through the night, around which the village gathered for the specific festivities of the occasion. The bonfire was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic in the ancient tradition of the fire at the summer's height, and practical in the specific way that a large communal fire on a summer night provided the light and the warmth and the focal point for the gathering that a summer evening without it wouldn't have. The jumping over the bonfire was the specific midsummer activity that combined the symbolic and the recreational with the specific physical excitement of the voluntary proximity to fire that the test of nerve required. The jump over the bonfire, clearing the flames or the embers of the burning, landing safely on the other side, was the specific test of courage and luck that the midsummer tradition prescribed, and its performance by the young men of the village was the performance of the festive courage that the occasion demanded. The midsummer herbs, the specific plants gathered on the eve of the feast for their supposed magical properties at this specific moment of the year, were the medieval intersection of the agricultural, the medicinal, and the magical that the feast day tradition regularly produced. The St. John's wort, gathered on Midsummer Eve, was the specific plant whose properties, the specific yellow flower, the specific bitter compounds that the modern pharmacologist identifies as the active antidepressant ingredients, the medieval tradition valued for reasons that combined the genuine medicinal observation with the magical attribution that the feast day's power was supposed to enhance. Carnival, the specific pre-Lenten festival that the Christian calendar placed in the days before the beginning of the Lenten fast, was the festival that most comprehensively expressed the medieval recreational culture's relationship with the festive license that the inversion of normal order permitted. The word carnival itself, from the Latin carnem levare, to remove meat, described the specific dietary function of the festival, the last opportunity to consume the meat and the fat and the rich foods that the Lenten fast would prohibit for the subsequent 40 days. But the carnival's function was not merely dietary. The specific social license of the carnival, the inversion of the normal social order, the wearing of masks and costumes that concealed identity and thereby released the wearer from the social obligations attached to their normal identity, the specific permission for the behavior that the normal order prohibited, was the medieval world's specific, institutionalized recognition that the maintenance of the normal order required the periodic release of the tensions that the normal order accumulated. The carnival's inversion of social hierarchy, the master dressed as the servant dressed as the master, the mock king of the festival elected from the lowest social level, the specific rituals that placed the normally subordinate person in the position of symbolic authority for the duration of the festival, was the specific festive expression of the social tension that the hierarchical medieval society maintained. The medieval carnival was not a revolution, it was a safety valve, the specific institutionalized temporary inversion of the order that allowed the order to resume after the festival without the pressure of the accumulated resentment that the festival had released. The specific food of the carnival, the excessive eating, the elaborate preparations, the specific foods associated with the pre-Lenten feast, was the feast before the fast, and its die's specific character reflected the specific contrast with the Lenten diet that would follow it, the eating of meat, of eggs, of the dairy products that the Lent prohibited. The specific food of the carnival was the food of the exception, consumed in the specific knowledge that the exception was about to end and that the period of constraint was approaching. Chapter 5. The Performers. The people whose entire job was to make other people have fun. The jongleur did not have a stable career. The specific professional situation of the medieval traveling entertainer, the jongleur, the minstrel, the gleeman, the specific itinerant performer whose income depended on the attention of whatever crowd had gathered in whatever hall or marketplace or fairground on any given day, was the professional situation of the person whose entire livelihood was contingent on the immediate reaction of the immediate audience, with no contract, no guaranteed booking, no institutional support, and no fallback position if the crowd decided they were not interested today. This is not so different from the situation of the modern stand-up comedian, or the busking musician, or the street performer, except that the medieval version of an indifferent crowd was an indifferent crowd that might also throw things, and the specific things that the medieval crowd threw when it was displeased with the performance were the things that the medieval crowd happened to have in its hands at the time, which in the marketplace context could be anything from the rotten vegetable to the considerably more dangerous object. The jongleur's repertoire was the specific varied toolkit of the professional entertainer who could not afford the luxury of the single specialty. The jongleur juggled, the specific skill of the multiple objects kept simultaneously airborne that the word itself preserves in its etymology. The French jongleur descending from the Latin jocular, to jest, the specific connection between the physical skill of the juggling and the general entertainment function of the jester that the etymology reveals. The jongleur also sang, told stories, performed acrobatics, did tumbling and contortion, and the various physical performance skills that the body trained from childhood could develop. The jongleur who could only do one thing was the jongleur who was unemployed when that one thing wasn't what the audience wanted. The repertoire of the medieval jongleur included the specific narrative entertainment that the medieval audience most wanted from their professional performers, the stories, the chansons de geste, the epic narratives of the heroes and the battles, and the specific adventures that the medieval literary tradition produced were not primarily the entertainment of the manuscript and the reading. They were the entertainment of the performance, the specific oral delivery of the story by the performer who had the repertoire of the narrative in memory, and the specific performance skills to deliver it in the way that the audience found compelling. The performance of the chanson de geste by the skilled jongleur was not the reading aloud of a text. It was the performance, the specific combination of the narrative, the musical accompaniment, the dramatic delivery, the performer's management of the audience's attention and emotional response through the specific techniques of the skilled storyteller. The jongleur who performed the Song of Roland for the Lord's Hall was doing what the skilled actor does, inhabiting the narrative, shaping the audience's experience, controlling the pace and the emphasis in the specific ways that the audience's reaction moment by moment required. The acrobats were the performers whose specific physical skills, the tumbling, the contortion, the specific feats of balance and strength that the trained body accomplished with the appearance of ease that the untrained observer found astonishing, were the entertainment of the immediate visual impact rather than the sustained narrative. The acrobat's performance was the performance of the impossible made possible, the specific entertainment of watching a human body do something that the observer's body could not do, and that the observer's understanding of physical possibility classified as at the edge of what was achievable. The contortionist bent in directions that the observing body registered with the specific visceral discomfort of the person whose own joints were making urgent objections to what they were witnessing. The tightrope walker performed at the height that activated the specific, involuntary fear response of the observer watching a human being in a situation where falling would be catastrophic. The strongman lifted the weight that the observer's body had no capacity to lift. Each of these was a performance of the body's extremity, the specific entertainment of seeing what the human body could be pushed to, accomplish when trained, committed, and performing for the crowd. The bear was not having fun. The bear baiting, the specific entertainment of the medieval and early modern period in which a captive bear, chained to a post in the bear baiting ring, was attacked by a succession of dogs, while the crowd placed bets on the outcomes of the specific encounters, and the bear attempted to defend itself with the considerable effectiveness of the 500-pound apex predator, whose claws and whose strength were advantages even against the dogs specifically bred for the purpose, was the specific entertainment of the crowd that found the spectacle of the animal combat compelling, in the way that the animal combat has been found compelling by crowds in every culture that has organized it. The bear was trained, or rather, the bear had been habituated to the performance environment through the specific brutal process of training that the bear baiters employed, which involved enough detail to make the modern animal welfare advocate wish they hadn't asked. The bear's training was the training of the animal, whose natural responses were being modified by the specific conditions of captivity and performance, until the bear's behavior in the baiting ring was the behavior of the animal that had learned, through the specific negative reinforcement of the training process, what the ring required of it. The bull baiting was the bear baiting's more accessible sibling. More accessible in the specific sense that bulls were more widely available and cheaper to maintain than bears, and that the specific entertainment of the bull being attacked by dogs was therefore available in a wider range of venues and communities than the bear baiting, which required the specific capital investment of the captive bear. The bull baiting also had the specific culinary connection that the bear baiting lacked. The bull baitings of the butcher's trade were conducted before slaughter on the specific folk biological theory that the baiting improved the quality of the meat by tenderizing the muscle through the exertion of the combat, a theory that the modern meat science does not support, but that the medieval butcher found sufficiently convincing to make the baiting a standard practice. The fool was the professional whose specific role in the medieval entertainment hierarchy occupied the position closest to the person who held the power. The court jester, the lord's fool, the specific entertainer whose proximity to the powerful person gave their specific brand of entertainment its unique character. The fool's specific license, the permission to say things to the powerful person that no other person could say without consequences, was the specific performance contract of the fool, the arrangement by which the entertainment of the jester was purchased with the tolerance of the criticism that the jester's performance embedded. The fool who was genuinely good at their job was not the fool who was merely funny. The fool who was genuinely good at their job was the fool who was funny in the specific way that held the truth inside the joke, who could say the thing that needed to be said to the person who needed to hear it in the form that made it possible for that person to receive it without the defensive response that the direct statement would have triggered. The medieval court jester, at their best, was the specific practitioner of the art that the modern political satirist practices, the communication of the uncomfortable truth through the medium of the entertainment that makes the discomfort bearable. The specific danger of the fool's role was the specific danger of the person who misjudged the tolerance of the powerful audience, the fool who went too far, who said the thing that was too true, who targeted the wound that was too raw, who chose the wrong moment for the criticism that the entertainment was packaging, was the fool who discovered the specific limits of the jester's license in the most direct possible way. The histories of the medieval and early modern period contain enough accounts of the punishment of the fool who overstepped to confirm that the license was real but not unlimited, and that the management of the boundary between the permitted and the forbidden was the specific professional skill on which the fool's continued employment and continued good health depended. Chapter 6. The Drinking. The specific, elaborate, occasionally catastrophic, recreational culture of the medieval tavern. The tavern was not just a pub. The specific institution of the medieval tavern, the alehouse, the wine shop, the inn, the various establishments in which the medieval population consumed alcohol in the social setting of the organized drinking place, was not the modern pub in the way that the modern pub is primarily a social venue where alcohol happens to be available. The medieval tavern was a specific node in the community's social, economic, and information network, the place where the specific transactions of the community that required a neutral, accessible public space were conducted alongside the drinking that provided the venue's economic foundation. The ale was the foundation of the medieval tavern, and the medieval ale, the specific low-alcohol, quickly souring, grain-based beverage that the alewife brewed and the tavern sold, was consumed in quantities that the modern person accustomed to the higher alcohol beers of the modern brewing tradition should not directly compare to their own drinking experience. The medieval person who drank 3 or 4 pints of the small ale of the ordinary day was consuming a beverage whose alcohol content was a fraction of the modern beers, whose caloric contribution was a real component of the day's nutritional intake, and whose social consumption was the specific form of the communal activity that the tavern organized around the shared drinking. The drinking games were the specific recreational activity that the tavern culture developed around the consumption of the ale, and their variety and their specific character reveal the particular creativity of the culture that had developed entertainment from the most available raw material. The toasting, the specific ritual of the communal drink in which each participant drank in response to the named person or thing that the toast honored, was the drinking game that the formal occasion adopted and that the informal occasion reduced to its essentials. The round of drinking organized around the performance of the specific social acknowledgments that the community required. The health drinking, the specific medieval drinking custom in which the health of the named person was drunk in the full cup, requiring the drinker to empty the vessel before the named health could be properly honored, was the specific custom that both the formal banquet and the informal tavern gathering practiced, with the specific consequence that the number of healths drunk in a given evening was a reliable indicator of the state of the participants at the evening's end. The number of people whose health required honoring expanded in direct proportion to the evening's progress, and the participants' diminishing capacity for discrimination between the people whose health genuinely merited drinking and the people whose health was being drunk because the game required another round. The Scotale was the specific medieval drinking occasion that combined the festive with the fundraising in the specific way of the community that needed to raise money for a specific purpose, and had discovered that the sale of ale at a communal gathering was the most reliable mechanism for doing so. The church ale, the bride ale, the help ale, the specific varieties of the Scot ale that different occasions organized, were the medieval equivalent of the community fundraiser, the charity auction, the crowdfunding campaign, organized around the specific human truth that people who are drinking are more likely to spend money than people who are sober. The bride ale, the drinking occasion organized around the bride's family's brewing and sale of ale at the wedding, whose proceeds contributed to the new household's establishment, was the specific institution that gives the modern world the word bridal. The bride ale having become through the centuries the bridle in the compound that the modern person uses without the faintest awareness of the specific medieval drinking occasion embedded in the etymology. The bride drank the ale. The guests bought the ale. The new household received the proceeds. The etymology survived the specific practice's disappearance by several hundred years. The specific games of the tavern drinking culture included the games that required the physical skill that the evening's consumption was, progressively undermining. The specific comedy of the game, whose difficulty increased as the player's capacity decreased. The 9 pins, the bowling game, whose pins were set up in the tavern yard, or the convenient open space adjacent to the drinking establishment, the ball rolled at them in the way that the modern bowling alley still organizes the same fundamental activity. Was the specific outdoor extension of the tavern's entertainment into the physical space that the indoor drinking venue couldn't accommodate. The quoits, the game of the iron or rope rings thrown at the stake in the ground, the specific aim required to encircle the stake or to land closest to it, defeating the opponent, was the tavern's outdoor game, in the way that the darts board became the indoor game of the later period. The quoits required the specific combination of aim and judgment that the casual player could manage adequately and the skilled player could manage exceptionally, and the gambling on the outcome of the quoits match was the gambling of the tavern's recreational culture applied to the physical game, rather than the cards or the dice. The singing was the tavern's specific communal entertainment that required the least equipment and the most participation. The round, the catch, the specific form of the overlapping vocal harmony that the medieval drinking song tradition developed for the voices of multiple drinkers of variable skill singing the same tune at different points simultaneously. The round required each voice to carry their part independently while the other parts proceeded around them, and its specific musical structure, the same melody sung by each voice beginning at a different point, was the musical form that produced complexity from simplicity in the specific way of the ingenious invention. Sumer is ecumen in the specific 13th century rota that the Reading Abbey manuscript preserves, is the earliest known example of the multi-voice round in the European musical tradition, and its survival in the monastic manuscript should not obscure its character as the specific entertainment of the singing culture rather than the solemn ritual of the liturgical tradition. The song is about summer and the cuckoo and the farting buck and the singing of the meadow, and its specific content is the content of the outdoor, seasonal celebratory song rather than the devotional music that the manuscript's ecclesiastical origin might suggest. Chapter 7. The Storytelling. How the medieval world entertained itself after dark. The night was long, the specific reality of the medieval night, longer, darker, and more comprehensively dark than the modern person's experience of the night has prepared them to imagine, was the specific environmental condition that shaped the medieval world's relationship with the after-dark hours, in ways that the electric light has made it almost impossible to reconstruct. Imaginatively, the medieval night without artificial light was not the dimly lit modern night of the street lamp and the illuminated window. It was the dark, the specific, complete, directional darkness of the environment without the electric light, punctuated only by fire, by candle, and by whatever the moon provided when the sky was clear. The fire was the center of the evening, the specific gathering of the household around the fire, for warmth in the winter, for light in all seasons, for the particular quality of the communal attention that the fire's movement and light and heat produced, was the specific social configuration of the medieval evening. The people arranged around the heat source in the way that every pre-modern household in every climate arranged itself around the fire when the day's work was done and the night required some form of occupation before sleep. The storytelling was the fire's specific entertainment, the story told to the assembled household in the specific intimacy of the gathered circle, the narrator's face lit by the fire while the darkness pressed in at the edges, the specific atmospheric conditions of the medieval evening's storytelling that the modern author of the Gothic novel is still trying to recreate with the written word. The fire was not incidental to the storytelling. The fire was the storytelling stage, its lighting, its specific environmental contribution to the experience of hearing a story in the dark. The stories told around the medieval fire were the entire range of the medieval narrative tradition, the heroic legends, the religious exempla, the local histories and the regional traditions, the fairy tales and the fables, and the specific comic narratives that every folk tradition develops for the entertainment of the after-dinner gathering. But the stories that the modern person would find most immediately engaging as the content of the medieval evening's entertainment were neither the heroic legends nor the religious exempla. They were the ghost stories. The ghost story was not a Halloween specialty in the medieval world. It was the year-round entertainment of the community that genuinely believed in the specific existence of the ghosts it was telling stories about. The revenants, the walking dead, the souls whose unfinished business or improper burial or violent death kept them tethered to the living world in the specific form of the apparition that came back to visit the places and the people associated with their life and their death. The medieval ghost was not the transparent chain-rattling specter of the Victorian tradition. The medieval ghost was a specific, embodied physical entity, a ghost that could be grabbed, that left footprints, that consumed food, that could be physically restrained. The specific corporeality of the medieval ghost reflects the specific theological understanding of the revenant in the medieval tradition, the body that had not yet been released into the purely spiritual condition of the afterlife, the specific intermediate state of the ghost between the physical and the spiritual that the medieval theology had to account for within the framework of the resurrection of the body that the Christian doctrine required. The stories of ghosts and revenants in the medieval chronicle tradition, the specific accounts that the monastic chroniclers recorded with the matter-of-fact directness of the reporter recording a fact rather than the skeptic recording a superstition, were the specific evidence of the medieval community's genuine engagement with the ghost as a real phenomenon requiring real management. The ghost that returned to haunt the village was the ghost that the village priest had to deal with. The specific exorcism, the reburial with proper rites, the specific religious intervention that the ecclesiastical tradition provided for the management of the restless dead. The fairy tale, the story of the specific supernatural beings of the medieval folk tradition whose relationship with the church's supernatural framework was the uncomfortable relationship of the pre-Christian supernatural with the Christian overlay, was the medieval storytelling tradition's most culturally complex genre, the specific form in which the ancient folk tradition's supernatural inhabitants of the landscape survived into the Christian period in the modified, partially Christianized form that the cultural negotiation of the conversion had produced. The fairies of the medieval tradition were not the small, winged, cheerful creatures of the Victorian children's book. They were the specific, dangerous, morally ambiguous beings of the folk tradition, the beings who could grant gifts and impose curses with equal ease, who stole children from their cradles and left changelings in their place, who led travelers astray on the moors and lured them to their deaths in the bogs, who could be propitiated by the specific gifts and the specific behaviors that the tradition had identified as effective, but who could not be controlled by any means that the ordinary person had available. The telling of the fairy tale was the telling of the story about beings whose reality the teller and the audience both accepted as genuinely possible. Not the entertainment of the impossible, but the specific management of the terrifying possible, through the narrative form that gave it structure and the distance of story that made it bearable to examine. The medieval fairy tale was the community's way of talking about the dangers of the landscape, the bogs, the dark woods, the sudden storms, the inexplicable deaths and disappearances that the pre-modern landscape regularly produced. In the narrative form that turned the shapeless terror into the specific, narratable danger that the story could contain. The riddle was the medieval evening's intellectual entertainment, the specific form of the verbal puzzle that required the listener to find the answer that the riddler had encoded in the specific, deliberately misleading language of the riddle's construction. The riddle tradition of the medieval period was the entertainment of the community that valued verbal cleverness in the specific way of the community, whose primary entertainment was verbal. The well-constructed riddle demonstrating the riddler's specific intelligence, and the correct answer demonstrating the answerer's specific quickness. The Exeter Book Riddles, the collection of Old English riddles preserved in the 10th century manuscript, are the specific surviving evidence of the riddle tradition that the medieval entertainment culture produced, and their content is the content of the everyday world. Observed with the specific attention of the riddle maker who sees in the familiar object the specific, unexpected angle of description that the riddle can exploit. The riddles describe the shield, the key the bookworm, the ox, the ice. The ordinary objects of the ordinary world rendered unrecognizable through the specific perspective shift of the riddle's oblique description. Several of the Exeter book riddles are, by the unambiguous standards of their specific imagery, obscene. The riddle, whose answer is the key and lock, rendered in terms that the medieval reader found funny, that the modern reader also finds funny, and that the editors of the Victorian scholarly editions found so distressing that they declined to translate them. The medieval riddle tradition's comfort with the obscene riddle, the specific entertainment of the double meaning that the innocent-sounding riddle concealed, was the comfort of the entertainment culture that did not have the Victorian tradition's specific anxieties about the publicly mentionable, and the specific delight of the medieval audience in the riddle, whose apparently innocent description concealed the obvious obscene answer, was the specific timeless delight of the innuendo that every human culture that has developed the capacity for language has discovered independently. Chapter 8. The Pilgrimage, the holiday that pretended to be something else. The pilgrimage was not only a religious exercise, the specific institution of the medieval pilgrimage, the journey to the shrine of the saint, the specific travel to the holy place, whose sacred associations made the journey an act of religious devotion, was the institution that Chaucer understood and documented with the specific clarity of the person who had been on pilgrimages, and who noticed, with the writer's observational precision, the specific gap between what the pilgrimage was supposed to be and what the pilgrimage actually was. What the pilgrimage was supposed to be was a journey of religious devotion, the specific physical effort of the travel as an act of penitence, the arrival at the shrine as the culmination of the spiritual journey that the physical journey represented, the contact with the saint's relics as the specific encounter with the sacred that the medieval theology of intercession made accessible to the ordinary person through the physical proximity to the holy object. What the pilgrimage actually was, for a substantial proportion of the people undertaking it, was a holiday, the specific holiday that the medieval world had available for the ordinary person who wanted to travel, to see something beyond the village, to eat in inns and drink in taverns, and meet people from other places, and hear stories from other regions, and generally do the things that the tourist has always done, but wrapped in the specific theological justification that made the holiday permissible in the medieval moral framework. The pilgrimage was the medieval package tour. The routes were established, the stopping points were known, the accommodations along the way were developed specifically for the pilgrim trade and the specific commerce of the pilgrimage industry. The souvenir badges sold at the shrine, the inns and the hospices that the pilgrim traffic supported, the guides and the local services that the pilgrim required, was the medieval tourist industry operating under the specific religious framing that the medieval world required for the organized leisure travel. The Canterbury Tales are the document of this reality. The specific social cross-section of the Canterbury pilgrimage that Chaucer assembled and animated for the specific purpose of illustrating the pilgrimage as the social occasion rather than the spiritual exercise. The knight and the miller and the wife of Bath and the pardoner are not the people of the solemn religious journey. They are the people of the road, the specific, various, recognizable people of the organized leisure travel whose stories and whose arguments and whose entertainments fill the specific hours of the journey. The wife of Bath has been on 5 pilgrimages and intends to go on more. Not primarily because she is exceptionally devout, but because the pilgrimage is the specific form of travel and social adventure that the medieval world made available to the woman of her social position, and she has found it an extremely effective one. The pilgrimage gave the medieval woman the specific social permission for independent travel, for interaction with strangers, for the kind of adventure that the ordinary structures of the medieval woman's life consistently denied, wrapped in the unassailable justification of the religious purpose that nobody could openly dispute. The pilgrim badge was the medieval tourist souvenir. The specific small metal or bone badge sold at the shrine that the pilgrim purchased as the evidence of their having been there and wore on their hat or their cloak for the journey home. The pilgrim badge industry was the specific commercial enterprise that the major shrines developed to service the pilgrim trade, and the variety and the quantity of pilgrim badges recovered from the archaeological record, from the Thames in London, from medieval rubbish deposits across Europe, is the specific evidence of how many people were making the pilgrimages and how thoroughly they were participating in the souvenir economy. Some of the pilgrim badges recovered from the Thames are, by the specific standards of their imagery, so explicitly obscene. The genitalia rendered in the pilgrim badge format, complete with the pilgrimage badge's characteristic ring for attachment to the hat, that the museum display of them requires the specific interpretive framework of the scholarly explanation to justify showing them to the general public. The obscene pilgrim badge was the medieval world's specific joke about the pilgrimage as a holiday rather than a spiritual exercise, the knowing wink of the culture that understood exactly what the pilgrimage was and found the specific gap between the stated purpose and the actual experience of the journey, funny enough to commemorate in the souvenir medal. The miracles at the shrine were the specific attraction that distinguished the religious pilgrimage from the secular journey, and that the ecclesiastical management of the shrine site promoted with the specific commercial awareness of the institution that understood its product's appeal. The miracle cure, the specific healing that the saint's intercession, mediated through the physical proximity to the saint's relics, produced in the sufferer who came to the shrine with the specific hope of the miraculous intervention, was the pilgrimage's specific promise, and the documentation of the miracles at the major shrines was the specific marketing that the shrine's keepers maintained to attract the pilgrims whose offerings supported the shrine's economic existence. The pilgrimage was the medieval world's specific, institutionalized, theologically justified form of the holiday. It was a holiday. The people on it were on holiday, and the specific fun they had on it. The stories told on the road, the inns visited, the companions encountered, the sights seen, the specific pleasures of the journey that Chaucer documented with the novelist's precision, was the genuine fun of the genuine holiday, dressed in the pilgrim's cloak and carrying the pilgrim's staff, and aimed eventually at the shrine. Chapter 9. The Children's Games. How medieval children played, and why it looks surprisingly familiar. The children were not little adults, the specific revision of the older historical thesis, the thesis associated primarily with Philippe Ariès and his 1960 work on the history of childhood, which argued that the medieval period had no concept of childhood as a distinct developmental phase, and therefore treated children as small adults, has been sufficiently thorough in the decades since that the thesis's specific claims can now be stated accurately. It was largely wrong, and the evidence of the medieval world's relationship with children and childhood demonstrates a genuine recognition of childhood as a specific stage of life with its own specific needs, its own specific entertainments, and its own specific protections. The medieval child played. This is not a surprising statement. The impulse to play is the specific biological endowment of the human child that no historical period has successfully eliminated. But the specific forms of the medieval child's play, documented in the manuscript illustrations and the archaeological record and the occasional written account, are both recognizable and surprising in the specific way of the historical distance that makes the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar recognizable. The spinning top was the medieval child's toy, the specific wooden or bone top that the child kept spinning with the whip or the twist of the fingers, the specific game of keeping the top in motion as long as possible, or competing to knock the opponent's top off balance. The top is among the oldest attested toys in the human archaeological record, present in contexts ranging from the ancient Mediterranean to the pre-Columbian Americas, and its presence in the medieval European child's repertoire is the presence of the specific toy that requires the minimum material investment and produces the maximum entertainment per unit of cost. The hoop and stick, the rolling hoop, of wood or iron that the child propelled along the ground with the stick, steering it through the obstacles and racing it against the hoops of other children, was the medieval child's outdoor toy, the specific recreational equipment of the open space, and the long, straight surface that the medieval village street and the common land provided. The hoop and stick requires nothing that cannot be scavenged from the woodpile and the iron scraps of the ordinary household, and its specific appeal, the V combination of the physical skill of keeping the hoop rolling and the kinetic pleasure of the moving object guided by the child's control, is the appeal of the toy that gives the child agency over something that moves. The dolls of the medieval period, the small figures of wood, clay, bone, and cloth that the archaeological record recovers from medieval contexts identified as children's, were the specific toys whose function was the same function that the doll has served in every period of human culture, the small-scale version of the human person that the child uses to rehearse the social interactions and the domestic scenarios that the adult world presents and that the child is preparing to manage. The medieval doll was not the painted porcelain doll of the Victorian nursery or the plastic fashion doll of the modern toy store. It was the small, rough, handmade figure that the parent had carved or sewn for the child, with the specific character that the handmade object always has. The evidence of the particular person who made it in the specific imperfections and the specific choices of the craft. The ball games were the children's outdoor entertainment in the recognizable form of the ball thrown, kicked, caught, and bounced that children in every period have developed around the basic physics of the ball. The medieval ball, stuffed leather, inflated bladder, carved wood, was the specific material form of the universal toy, and the games that the medieval children played with it were the games that every child culture has independently invented. The throwing at a target, the catching between players, the kicking competition, the game of keeping the ball in the air as long as possible. The specific game that the medieval manuscript illustration most frequently depicts children playing is a form of the competitive ball game that the manuscript artist rendered as the closest visual approximation of what they were seeing. The children in the courtyard or the street engaged in the specific, enthusiastic, occasionally chaotic activity of the ball game that the adult prohibition would one day formalize into the rules and the regulations of the organized sport, and that the children were in the meantime playing with the specific freedom of the game that hasn't been codified yet. The blindfold games, the specific form of the children's game, in which one player, blindfolded, attempted to catch or identify the other players who were taunting them and evading, were the medieval child's game that the modern child still plays in the form of blind man's buff, the specific game that requires no equipment beyond the blindfold, and produces the specific combination of the sensory deprivation, the physical comedy, and the competitive element that makes it the perennial entertainment of the large group of children with nothing to do. The swimming holes of the medieval summer, the specific river bend, the mill, pond, the flooded gravel pit, where the children swam in the summer months, with the specific combination of the pleasure of the cool water and the complete absence of adult supervision that the swimming hole always provided, were the medieval child's summer entertainment and the medieval adult's summer anxiety. The drowning of children in the mill pond appears in the medieval accident records with a frequency that confirms both how often the children were swimming unsupervised and how unprepared many of them were for the specific dangers that the unfamiliar water presented. The specific play of the medieval child was the specific play of the human child in any period. The instinctive, biological, developmental play of the organism that learns through play, that rehearses adult activities through play, that develops physical and social skills through play, and that finds in the play the specific joy of the activity undertaken for its own sake, rather than for any outcome beyond. The activity itself. The medieval child spinning the top and the modern child playing the video game are doing the same thing, exercising the specific human capacity for play that is the species' specific contribution to the repertoire of the mammalian young. Chapter 10. The music. What medieval people actually listened to, and why it sounds nothing like what you imagine. The medieval music was not the thing playing in the background of the fantasy film. The specific sonic texture of the medieval period, as the modern entertainment industry has decided to render it, the reverberant, modal, slightly mournful combination of the female voice, and the sparse drone that signals to the modern audience that what they are watching takes place in the period before everything got louder and more interesting, is the aesthetic choice of the modern composer and the modern sound designer, not the documented reality of what the medieval world heard when it listened to music. The medieval world's actual music was considerably more varied, considerably more energetic, considerably louder, and considerably more fun than the atmospheric backdrop of the fantasy genre has led the modern person to expect. The distinction between the sacred music and the secular music is the first distinction that the history of medieval music requires. Not because the distinction was always clearly maintained in practice, but because the two traditions developed along different lines, and the surviving record is so thoroughly skewed toward the sacred that the secular music requires the specific imaginative reconstruction that its relative lack of documentary survival makes necessary. The sacred music survives because the Church wrote it down. The Gregorian chant, the polyphony of the Notre Dame school, the specific liturgical music of the medieval Church. These are documented in the manuscript tradition with the care and the thoroughness of the institution that understood the music as an essential component of the liturgical practice, and that therefore preserved it with the same rigor applied to the preservation of the theological texts. The secular music of the same period, the dance music, the tavern songs, the specific entertainment music of the jongleur and the minstrel, was largely not written down because the people performing it didn't read music notation, and the people for whom they performed didn't need them to. The troubadour tradition of southern France, the specific poetic and musical culture of the Occitan-speaking South that flourished from the 11th to the 13th century, and that produced the specific genre of the courtly love lyric in its most elaborate form, is the secular music tradition with the richest documentary survival, precisely because the troubadour culture was aristocratic, literate, and sufficiently self-conscious about its own cultural production to document it. The troubadour songs, the canso, the serventes, the alba, the specific genres of the troubadour repertoire, were written down with their melodies in the manuscript tradition that the troubadour culture maintained. The specific character of the troubadour melody, the modal scales, the specific rhythmic patterns, the ornamented vocal style that the troubadour performance required, is the character that the modern early music performance tradition has spent decades reconstructing from the manuscripts. And the result of this reconstruction is music that is genuinely beautiful in its own terms, but genuinely unfamiliar to the modern ear, accustomed to the tonal harmonies of the post-Renaissance musical tradition. The troubadour melody is not the background music of the fantasy film. It is more interesting than that, and more strange. The dance music was the medieval music that the body most directly engaged with, the specific rhythmically driven music. For the carol, the estampi, the various dance forms, that the medieval festive culture organized around the communal experience of movement together. The carol, the ring dance, in which the dancers formed a circle or a chain, moving together in the specific coordinated steps that the dance required, singing the song that provided both the music and the beat, was the specific dance form that appears most frequently in the medieval literary and pictorial record as the characteristic entertainment of the festive occasion. The carol required no instrumentalist. It was the dance whose music was the dancers themselves, the singing of the dance's song providing the musical accompaniment for the dancing that the song required. The specific efficiency of the carol as a festive activity was the efficiency of the entertainment that needed no equipment and no specialist performer. Just a group of people who knew the song and the steps and the willingness to make fools of themselves in the company of other people making fools of themselves, which is the specific social lubricant of the communal dance in every culture that has developed it. The instruments of the medieval period were more varied than the modern person's imagination of the medieval instrument, the harp, and the lute tends to suggest. The hurdy-gurdy was the medieval instrument of the ordinary performer. The stringed instrument played by the turning of the rosined wheel that produced the continuous drone, with the melody played on the keyboard that stopped the strings at the required pitches. The hurdy-gurdy produced a sound that the modern person accustomed to the guitar and the piano finds simultaneously strange and compelling. The specific combination of the drone and the melody that the instrument's design required, the nasal, buzzing quality of the rosined wheel's friction against the string. The bagpipe was the medieval instrument of the outdoor performance and the dance music. The specific instrument whose design, the yof, bag maintaining the continuous airflow that the melody pipes required, produced the sustained sound of the outdoor entertainment that the intermittent breath of the flute or the recorder could not match. The medieval bagpipe was present across a far wider geographic range than the modern person's association of the bagpipe with Scotland tends to imply. The instrument appears in the medieval iconography of England, France, Germany, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula with equal frequency, the specific useful instrument of the outdoor music that every region developed independently. The drum was the rhythm, the specific, simple, powerful instrument whose contribution to the dance music was the beat that organized the dancers' bodies into the synchronized movement that the communal dance required. The tabor, the small drum carried and played by the same performer who played the pipe. The specific one-man band combination of the pipe and tabor that allowed a single musician to provide both the melody and the rhythm for the dance was the most frequently depicted instrument in the medieval festive scene. The specific image of the medieval dance musician that the manuscript illustration returns to again and again as the characteristic figure of the musical entertainment. The music was loud, the specific loudness of the outdoor medieval music, the volume required to be heard across the village green, above the noise of the crowd, over the wind of the autumn fair, was the loudness of the instrument designed for outdoor performance, and the specific sonic character of the medieval outdoor music was the character of the music that needed to carry. The modern early music performance in the acoustically designed concert hall is a different experience from the medieval performance in the market square, and the specific difference is the difference between the controlled and the uncontrolled acoustic, between the music designed to be listened to in silence, and the music designed to make the crowd dance whether they wanted to or not. Chapter 11. The hunting, the sport that was also a status symbol, and also extremely complicated. The hunt was not simply killing an animal. The specific elaboration of the medieval hunt, the ritual, the protocol, the specialized vocabulary, the specific hierarchy of the hunting party, and the specific roles of its various participants, the detailed ceremonial of the kill, and the processing of the carcass that the medieval hunting tradition had developed, reveals the specific function of the hunt as something considerably more than the practical activity of obtaining meat. The medieval hunt was a performance, the specific performance of the aristocratic identity, the demonstration of the specific qualities of courage and skill and control, and the proper relationship with the natural world that the medieval warrior culture valued, and that the hunt provided the specific outdoor arena to display. The hunting law was the first thing that established the hunt as the aristocratic preserve, the specific legislation of the Norman conquest, and the subsequent medieval legal tradition that restricted the right to hunt the deer and the boar of the royal forest to the king and those he specifically permitted, transforming the deer of the English landscape from the food source of whoever could catch them into the specifically protected property of the crown and the aristocracy. The forest law, the specific legal framework of the royal forest, the most hated legislation of the Norman imposition in the minds of the English population it was imposed upon, was the specific mechanism by which the hunt was legally made, the sport of the wealthy, and the poaching of the game was made the crime of the poor. The stag hunt was the premier form of the noble hunt. The specific, elaborate chase of the red deer stag through the forest that the medieval hunting treatises documented with the reverent attention of the tradition that considered this activity the highest expression of the active life available to the person of gentle birth. The hart, The adult male red deer of 5 years or older was the quarry of the highest status, the specific animal whose pursuit required the best horses, the best hounds, the most skilled huntsmen, and the most demanding terrain, and whose successful conclusion demonstrated the specific combination of physical courage, horsemanship, and hunting knowledge that the aristocratic culture valued. The vocabulary of the hunt was the specific shibboleth of the aristocratic class. The technical terminology of the hunting tradition that the person of gentle birth was expected to know, and that the person who did not know it identified themselves immediately as the person who had not been raised in the culture that the hunt represented. The specific terms for the deer's antlers at different stages of growth, for the droppings of different animals, for the specific stages of the processing of the carcass after the kill. This vocabulary was the specific linguistic marker of the class identity that the medieval hunt culture maintained, with the obsessive precision of the community that uses specialized language to identify its members. The Book of St. Albans, the late 15th century hunting manual attributed to the prioress Juliana Berners, is the specific document that preserves the elaborate collective nouns of the medieval hunting tradition, and it is the source of the specific cultural fascination with the collective noun that the English language has never entirely lost. A murder of crows, a parliament of owls, an unkindness of ravens, a pride of lions. These are not the folk inventions of the casual observer. They are the specific products of the medieval hunt culture's elaborate taxonomy of the natural world, developed by the people who spent enough time in the forest to want precise language for what they saw there. The falconry was the hunt's aerial dimension, the specific form of the hunting sport in which the trained raptor replaced the trained hound as the instrument of the pursuit and the kill, and whose specific combination of the training skill and the hunting knowledge required made it the most intellectually demanding form of the medieval hunt. The trained falcon, the peregrine, the gerfalcon, the merlin, the specific species assigned by the medieval falconry hierarchy to the specific social ranks of the hunting tradition, was a capital investment of considerable magnitude, and the product of years of training that the skilled falconer applied to the specific, demanding process of taking a wild raptor and converting it into the cooperative hunting partner that the sport required. The hierarchy of the falconry was the hierarchy of the medieval social order expressed through the medium of the bird. The emperor flew the eagle. The king flew the gerfalcon. The prince flew the falcon gentle, the peregrine in its most prized form. The knight flew the saker. The squire flew the lanner. The lady flew the merlin. The yeoman flew the goshawk. The priest flew the sparrowhawk. The knave, the servant, the lowest rank of the falconry hierarchy, flew the kestrel. The specific bird assigned to the specific social rank was the specific shorthand of the social identity expressed through the visible medium of the bird on the fist, the emblem of the rank, as legible to the medieval observer as the heraldic device on the shield. The poaching was the poor person's hunt, the specific, illegal, dangerous participation in the activity that the law reserved for the wealthy, conducted at the risk of the specific punishments that the forest law prescribed for the unauthorized taking of the king's deer. The penalties for poaching in the early medieval period were extreme. Blinding, castration, and death were the specific consequences that the Norman forest law prescribed for the serious poacher. And their severity was the specific indication of how seriously the crown regarded the royal forest as the property right that the law had to protect by the most disproportionate available means. The poacher was not always the starving peasant of the Robin Hood tradition, though the starving peasant did poach, and the moral logic of the act was sufficiently clear to the medieval community that the poacher was rarely without sympathizers, even when the law eventually caught up with them. The poaching was also the sport of the minor gentry and the younger sons, and the various people of sufficient social position to want the hunt, but insufficient land to hunt legally. The specific gray zone of the medieval hunting law, where the legal and the illegal shaded into each other in ways that the specific circumstances of each case made difficult to adjudicate. Robin Hood was the poacher as hero. The specific narrative that the English folk tradition developed around the figure of the outlaw who poached the king's deer and stole from the rich and gave to the poor, whose specific appeal to the medieval audience was the appeal of the figure who broke the law that the audience found unjust and got away with it in the forest that the law had made inaccessible. Robin Hood was not the historical person, or rather the historical persons who may have contributed to the legend are irrelevant to the legend's function, which was the specific narrative function of the story that said what the medieval English community wanted to say about the forest law and the people who enforced it. Chapter 12. The Mockery. How the medieval world laughed at itself and everyone else. The medieval world was funny. Not funny in the careful, self-conscious way of the culture that is worried about being funny. Not the comedy of the performance that is aware of its audience and its reception and the specific conditions of its approval. Funny in the specific, unself-conscious way of the culture that finds things genuinely amusing and says so with the directness of the person who has not yet learned to perform ironic detachment as a substitute for actual laughter. The carnival laughter, the specific form of the communal public laughter that the medieval festive tradition cultivated as the specific antidote to the solemnity of the official culture, was the laughter that Mikhail Bakhtin described in the 20th century as the particular achievement of the medieval and early modern popular culture, the laughter that inverted the hierarchy, that brought the high down and raised the low up, that found in the body and its functions the specific raw material of the comedy that the official culture of the church and the court was trying to transcend and that the popular culture was insisting on celebrating. The Feast of Fools was the specific institutionalized inversion of the ecclesiastical hierarchy that the medieval church periodically produced and periodically tried to suppress. The feast in which the minor clergy and the subdeacons elected their own mock bishop, conducted the liturgy in the burlesque form that replaced the sacred text with the comic version, and generally performed the specific parody of the ecclesiastical ceremony that the church authorities found simultaneously scandalous and impossible to entirely eliminate. The specific content of the Feast of Fools ceremony, the mock mass with its substitution of the obscene for the sacred, the burning of incense with old shoes in the thurible, the specific inversions of the liturgical protocol that the feast required, was the content of the institution that understood itself as the safety valve of the ecclesiastical system, the specific release of the tensions that the hierarchical and demanding life of the medieval church community accumulated. The clergy who participated in the Feast of Fools were not the clergy who had lost their faith. They were the clergy who had found, in the specific inversion of their daily practice, the specific relief of the thing laughed at rather than merely endured. The fabliaux were the medieval comic narrative, the short verse tales of the French tradition whose specific content was the content of the comedy that the courtly love tradition was trying to transcend and that the fabliau was insisting on returning to. The fabliau was the story of the unfaithful wife and the cuckolded husband and the clever priest and the stupid merchant and the various combinations of these characters in the specific situations that the comedy of the body and its appetites produced. The fabliau was not subtle. It was not trying to be subtle. It was trying to be funny, and the specific tools it used, the pratfall, the misdirection, the obscene revelation, the comic reversal, were the tools of the comedy that had worked since the human species, developed the capacity for narrative. The specific targets of the medieval comic tradition were the targets that every comedy tradition has found reliable: the pompous, the hypocritical, the powerful, the pretentious, the fat priest who preached fasting, the merchant who claimed honesty while cheating his customers, the knight who claimed bravery while avoiding the dangerous situation, the bishop who claimed chastity while maintaining the specific domestic arrangements that chastity technically precluded. These were the comedy targets of the medieval tradition, and the specific comedy of their exposure was the comedy of the gap between the claimed identity and the actual behavior that the medieval satirist identified with the same observational precision that the modern satirist deploys. The animal fable was the medieval comic and satirical form that used the specific indirection of the non-human character to make the points about human behavior that the direct statement would have made too dangerous. Reynard the fox, the specific figure of the trickster animal, whose adventures in the Roman de Renard constituted one of the most popular narrative cycles of the medieval French tradition, was the specific vehicle for the social satire of the medieval period, dressed in the fur of the fox, who was cleverer than the powerful animals that surrounded him, and whose cleverness was the specific instrument of his survival and their humiliation. The wolf was the noble, the lion was the king, the bear was the powerful lord, and the fox was the specific small, clever, amoral operator who survived by being smarter than the powerful, rather than more powerful than the powerful. The specific fantasy of the person without power, who wants to believe that cleverness is sufficient substitute for it. Reynard cheated, lied, seduced, betrayed, and generally behaved with the specific immorality of the creature whose survival required the abandonment of the principles that the powerful could afford and the weak could not, and the medieval audience loved him for it. The mock epic, the specific literary form that applied the high style of the epic narrative to the low subject matter of the everyday and the trivial, was the medieval world's specific literary joke about the gap between the literary pretension and the reality it was supposed to describe. The Nun's Priest's Tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the story of the rooster Chanticleer and the fox, told in the full rhetorical apparatus of the tragic epic, is the specific, perfect example of the form. The comedy of the grandiose style applied to the farmyard drama, producing the specific effect of the deflation that the genre contrast creates. The visual comedy of the medieval world was the comedy of the manuscript margin, the specific space of the illuminated manuscript where the artist deposited the visual jokes, the grotesque figures, the scenes of the everyday incongruity that the main text's sacred content did not accommodate, the bas de page scenes of the Gothic manuscript, the hunting scenes in which the rabbits hunt the hunters, the knights jousting against snails, the pigs playing bagpipes, the monkeys performing the human ceremonies of the church and the court, were the visual equivalent of the fabliau, the specific comedy of the inversion, and the incongruity rendered in the specific humor of the craftsman who was spending their working life illustrating the sacred text and was putting their actual sense of humor in the margins where the supervisor's attention was least likely to fall. The jousting snail is the specific visual joke that appears with remarkable frequency in the margins of the Gothic manuscript tradition. The specific incongruity of the armored knight jousting against the garden snail, apparently with genuine uncertainty about the outcome. And its frequency is the frequency of the joke that the manuscript tradition found, genuinely funny rather than the single clever invention of a single unusually inventive artist. Someone drew the first jousting snail. Everyone who saw it found it funny. Everyone who found it funny drew their own version. The jousting snail became the specific visual meme of the medieval manuscript margin. Chapter 13. The magic, the specific supernatural entertainment that the medieval world took seriously. The magician was not a stage performer. The specific distinction between the modern magician, the stage performer whose specific art is the concealment of the mundane mechanism behind the appearance of the impossible, and the medieval practitioner of magic is the distinction between the person who knows their miracles are tricks and the person who believes, or at least claims to believe, that they are not. The medieval magician was not performing the illusion of the supernatural, or rather the medieval magician who was performing the illusion of the supernatural was a very small subset of the people who practiced what the medieval world classified as magic, and the majority were practicing something they considered to be a real engagement with real forces in the real world. The astrology was the magic that the educated medieval person took most seriously as a legitimate intellectual discipline. the specific practice of the reading of the celestial configurations as the indicators of the terrestrial events that the astrological theory held the heavens to determine. The astrologer was not the carnival fortune teller of the fairground booth. They were the specific intellectual practitioners of a discipline that the medieval university took seriously, that the medieval courts consulted regularly, and that the medieval medical traditions integrated into the clinical practice of the physician who would not administer the treatment without first consulting the astrological chart. The horoscope of the medieval court astrologer was a serious document produced by a serious person using the best available astronomical knowledge of the period to make the specific predictions that the client required. The medieval king who consulted the astrologer before the battle was not the medieval king making an irrational decision. He was the medieval king consulting the best available predictive technology that his culture had developed, in the specific way that the modern leader consults the polling data and the economic forecast, with roughly comparable reliability. The divination was the magic of the specific question, the specific technique applied to the specific situation to produce the specific information that the ordinary means of knowing could not supply. The casting of lots, the reading of the entrails, the specific interpretation of the random event as the meaningful signal. These were the technologies of the uncertain future that the medieval person applied with the specific pragmatism of the community that lived with a great deal of genuine uncertainty and wanted any available tool for managing it. The love magic was the specific application of the magical tradition to the specific human problem of the desired person who did not reciprocate the desire. The herbs and the words and the specific objects that the folk magic tradition prescribed for the induction of love in the reluctant beloved. The love magic recipe, the specific combination of the herb and the spoken word and the buried object and the performed action that was supposed to make the named person love the practitioner, was the specific practical magic of the person who had found the direct approach insufficient and was willing to try the supernatural assistance. The cunning man and the cunning woman were the local magical practitioners of the medieval and early modern village. The specific people whose knowledge of the herb medicine, the charm, the divination, and the various other magical technologies of the folk tradition made them the resource that the village consulted when the priest's help was insufficient, or the physician was too expensive, or the specific problem was one that the official institutions didn't handle. The cunning folk were the magical general practitioners of the medieval community, the first resort for the lost object, the sick animal, the curse that needed lifting, the future that needed reading. The specific entertainment dimension of the magical tradition was the wonder, the specific pleasure of the witnessed marvel, the thing that exceeded the ordinary expectation of what the world was capable of producing. The medieval traveler's account was full of the specific wonders of the distant place, the dog-headed people of the eastern margins of the map, the magnetic mountain that drew the iron nails from the ships passing too close, the fountain of youth in the territory of Prester John. These were not the lies of the dishonest traveler. They were the specific entertainment of the wonder story that the medieval audience consumed with the same pleasure that the modern audience consumes the science fiction narrative of the impossible, rendered with sufficient specificity to seem temporarily plausible. The street magician, the specific performer whose tricks were the tricks of the skilled hand, and the misdirected attention rather than the genuine supernatural intervention, was present in the medieval world as the specific entertainer of the marketplace and the fair, the performer who produced the coin from behind the ear, and the rabbit from the apparently empty bag, and the card from the apparently shuffled deck. The medieval audience that watched the street magician was the audience that was not always sure whether it was watching the skill of the trained hand or the genuine intervention of the supernatural, and the specific ambiguity of the street magician's performance. The deliberate cultivation of the uncertainty about the mechanism behind the effect was the specific entertainment strategy of the performer, who understood that the uncertain miracle was more compelling than either the certain trick or the certain genuine miracle. The witch was the magic's dark side, the specific figure of the practitioner of the harmful magic, the evil eye, the curse, the magical attack on the neighbor's cattle or the rival's children. The witch belief in the medieval period was not the product of the paranoid fantasy of the persecutor. It was the specific logical consequence of the magical worldview that attributed the misfortune of the bewitched to the malicious intention of the bewitcher, and that the specific social tensions of the village community regularly produced suspects for when the attribution of malice required a specific target. The entertainment of the witch trial, and this requires the specific, uncomfortable acknowledgement that the witch trial was, for the medieval and early modern community that attended it, a form of public entertainment in the specific sense of the public event that the community attended, discussed, and found compelling, was the entertainment of the drama of accusation, confession, and punishment played out in the public space that the legal proceeding provided. This is not a comfortable fact, but the discomfort of the fact is the specific discomfort of the honest engagement with the past and the dishonest alternative. The pretense that the entertainment dimension of the public trial was not part of its function is worse. Chapter 14. The reading. What medieval people did with stories when they were written down. The book was not ordinary. The specific material reality of the medieval book, the manuscript, the hand-copied text on the prepared animal skin of the vellum or parchment, the object that required the labor of the scribe for the months of careful work that a single volume could represent, and the capital investment of the materials that the parchment and the ink and the binding required, was the material reality of the thing that was simultaneously the most powerful information technology of the period and the most expensive object that most people would never own. The book's expense was the expense of the labor-intensive craft. The parchment required the specific processing of the animal hide, the scraping and the stretching, and the drying of the skin into the thin, smooth writing surface that the scribe required. The ink required the preparation. The binding required the woodwork and the leatherwork, and all of these were merely the materials. The labor of the scribe who wrote the text was the labor of the trained person whose working day, applied to the task of copying, produced a number of pages that the modern typist could match in a few hours. The reading of the medieval book was therefore the reading of the object that embodied a significant investment of time and skill, and the medieval reader's relationship with the book was the relationship of the person who understood the object's value in the specific material terms of what it had cost to produce. The careless reader of the medieval manuscript, the person who let the damp get to the parchment, or the careless elbow overturn the ink, or the fire that consumed the binding, was the person who had destroyed an object of real, substantial, irreplaceable value. But the book was not only the object of the wealthy. The reading of books in the medieval period was more socially distributed than the ownership of books, because the reading of books was a social activity in the specific sense of the performance. The reading aloud to the assembled audience that was the primary mode of the medieval literary experience. The person who owned the book read it aloud to the people who did not own the book, and the people who did not own the book heard the stories of the people who did. And the literature circulated through the community in the specific form of the oral performance of the written text. The romance was the specific literary entertainment of the medieval period that the modern reader finds most immediately accessible. The genre of the adventure narrative, the hero's quest, the love story, the specific pleasures of the narrative that proceeds through the specific excitements of the combat and the discovery, and the reunion and the resolution. The Arthurian romance, the specific cycle of the narrative that the court of King Arthur generated in the medieval literary imagination, was the specific content of the medieval entertainment reading in the way that the streaming series is the specific content of the modern entertainment viewing. The ongoing narrative that the audience returned to for the next installment, the characters that the audience knew well enough to have opinions about, the world that the imagination had furnished sufficiently to feel familiar. The specific pleasures of the Arthurian romance were the pleasures of the genre that had developed the specific tools of the narrative entertainment to a high degree of sophistication. the interweaving of multiple storylines, the character development across the long narrative, the specific tension of the outcome that the reader could anticipate but not know precisely, the emotional engagement with the characters that the good narrative writing produces regardless of the period of its composition. Lancelot and Guinevere, and the specific impossible situation of the love that betrayed the loyalty, were the specific emotional content of the Arthurian romance that the medieval audience engaged with as fully as the modern audience engages with the comparable contemporary narrative. The reading group of the medieval convent or the monastery, the specific social practice of the reading aloud, at meals, the lector reading, while the community ate in the silence that the monastic rule required and the reading provided, was the specific institution of the medieval literary community that maintained the reading as the daily practice, the regular engagement with the text, that the monastic tradition made the foundation of the intellectual life. The monastic library was the medieval equivalent of the streaming service, the curated collection of the available content from which the community selected the texts for the reading practice, maintained with the specific care of the institution that understood the collection as its most important cultural resource. The specific delight of the medieval reading, the delight that the scribal tradition records in the marginal notes of the manuscripts, the specific human responses to the text that the reader left in the margin alongside the text they were reading, was the delight of genuine engagement with the story. The scribe who wrote, "This is a good book," in the margin. The reader who noted, "I read this on a cold Tuesday, and it warmed me." The specific personal idiosyncratic responses to the text that the margin preserved alongside the text itself. These are the evidence of the medieval reader's genuine, enthusiastic, individual engagement with the literature, the specific human responses to the story that the centuries have not changed in the way that the medium has changed. Conclusion: the playing animal. What 700 years of medieval fun tells us about being human. The fun was not frivolous. This is the specific conclusion that the entire history of medieval recreation points toward, and it is the conclusion that requires the specific effort of the argument rather than the simple assertion, because the instinct of the serious historical inquiry is always to treat the recreation as the footnote, the thing that happened between the important events, the light relief between the battles and the plagues and the political crises that the history textbook identifies as the content of the past worth recording. The instinct is wrong. The recreation is not the footnote. The play is not the interruption of the human story. The play is one of the central chapters of the human story, and the specific forms that the medieval world developed for its entertainment are among the more revealing documents of what the medieval world actually valued, actually feared, actually desired, and actually was. The tournament tells us that the medieval warrior culture was not the grim, functional violence machine of the military history. It was the culture that found, in the controlled, ritualized performance of violence, the specific entertainment of the society that had made violence central to its value system, and that needed to celebrate that centrality in the specific form of the spectacle. The tournament was not a side effect of medieval violence. It was the medieval culture's specific, enthusiastic, expensive celebration of the thing it valued most. The dice game and the gambling tell us that the medieval person was not the passive sufferer of whatever fortune the world assigned them. They were the active, engaged participant in the specific attempt to control the outcome of the uncertain through the specific combination of skill and luck that the gambling game provided. The gambling was the medieval person's specific engagement with the problem of uncertainty. Not a resignation to it, but an attempt to master it, to find the edge, to develop the skill that the pure luck game didn't reward, and the mixed luck and skill game did. The storytelling tells us that the medieval person had an inner life, a rich, complex, imaginative inner life that the ghost story and the fairy tale and the romance and the riddle all addressed in their specific ways, providing the specific entertainment of the imagination engaged with the narrative of the possible and the impossible and everything in between. The story was not the medieval person's substitute for information. It was the specific technology of the imagination that the human species has always required, and that the medieval period developed with the specific sophistication of the culture that had nothing else to do with the long winter evening. The festival tells us that the medieval person understood something about the rhythm of the human life, that the modern world of the continuous working week has partially lost, that the exceptional day gives the ordinary day its meaning, that the feast makes the fast bearable, that the specific interruption of the routine is not the enemy of productivity but its condition. The medieval calendar with its feast days and its festivals was not the inefficient management of a pre-industrial labor supply. It was the specific sophisticated management of the human being's need for the exceptional alongside the ordinary. The children's games tell us that childhood in the medieval period was recognizably childhood, the specific biological developmental phase of the human life, in which the play is the work, in which the top and the hoop and the ball and the story are the specific instruments of the development of the person who will eventually put the toy down and pick up the plow. The medieval child who played was the medieval child developing in exactly the same way that the modern child who plays is developing, and the continuity of the play across the 700 years is the specific evidence of the continuity of the human developmental need that the play addresses. The mockery and the humor tell us that the medieval world was not solemn, that the specific, irreverent, body-centered, hierarchy-puncturing humor of the medieval comic tradition was the expression of the culture's genuine engagement with the gap between the official account of the world and the actual experience of living in it. The jousting snail in the manuscript margin was not the artistic failure of the distracted craftsman. It was the specific, precise, knowing joke of the person who spent their days illuminating the sacred text, and who had found in the margin the specific space of the permitted irreverence that made the rest of the work bearable. The medieval world played. It played with the specific enthusiasm of the world that had no guarantee of tomorrow, and that had therefore learned to play today with the full commitment of the person for whom the present moment is the only moment available with certainty. The Black Death would come and take a third of the population, and the people who survived would play again, because the playing was the specific affirmation of the living that the presence of the death made more necessary rather than less. The tournament continued after the plague. The dice rolled in the taverns that the pestilence had emptied and refilled. The carol danced on the village green in the summer that followed the worst winter. The children spun their tops in the courtyards of the houses where death had visited and departed. The jongleur performed for the crowd that was smaller than it had been. The story was told around the fire by the person who had lived to tell it, to the people who had lived to hear it. This is not the grim picture of the medieval life. This is the true picture of the medieval life. The specific, irreducible, unkillable human capacity for the play, and the fun, and the laughter in the story, that the historical record, if you look at it with the right attention, documents with the same fidelity that it documents the battles and the famines, and the ecclesiastical controversies that the textbook prefers. The medieval person was a playing animal. They played with the same seriousness and the same joy, and the same inventiveness that the modern person brings to the specific forms of the play that the modern world provides. The forms are different. The impulse is identical. And the impulse, the specific, biological, irrepressible human desire to play, is the thing that the 700 years cannot touch. That is what the medieval fun tells us about being human. That is, in the end, what all of history tells us about being human. We play. We have always played. We will play until the last person turns off the last light, and there is no one left to find it funny. And in this specific, unrepeatable, finite window of the present tense, there is a tournament starting, and a dice game in the tavern, and a story being told by the fire, and a child spinning a top in the courtyard dust. Go and watch. Go and play. You will not regret having spent the time.